My own wife might be listening. I haven't got a second wife anywhere. So I'll read that again. Hello, I love you to my amazing wife, Martina, from Paul the Trucker.
Enforcement is very important. I accept the strategy of the police in trying to inform and educate and encourage people to do the right thing. But we also must get to the point at some stage for some of those recalcitrant people who will not do the right thing, that there are penalties in place to deal with that. And the Justice Minister, as the member will know, has brought forward to the Executive new penalties, which we ratified last week. And as well as that, the Executive has their enforcement group, which is working not just with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, but with local government, with environmental health, and indeed with the Health and Safety Executive. And I hope as well with some of the larger retail sectors. I said in my statement, Mr. Speaker, that we would be engaging with the retail sector. We haven't closed the retail sector, it is still open, but we want to work with them to mitigate against some of the compliance issues that very clearly are there at present, and I hope that they will work with us to try and make sure that we make sure that their staff are safe and that their customers are safe as well. So that's what we want to do, and we will be doing that over the next couple of days.
And I call Jim Allister.
Sure, the last 24 hours have been far from confidence building. For weeks we were told, apparently in medical advice, that our homes were the danger spots and pubs were safe and you could see your granny in the pub, so to speak. Now we're told that hospitality has to close, and of course the great losers in that will be some of the lowest paid in our society. Our schools, kids have had 28 days of schooling in 7 months, and now they are to close. What assurance is there that we're not just going into lockdown by stages? That if things aren't better in a fortnight, that our schools will reopen, and meanwhile off-licences are open. My specific question is this: are our schools expected during this 2 weeks to also provide the facilities for key workers? There's been some teachers have been diligently in school since March. Does that have to continue? And in respect of sporting events, can, for example, Irish League matches continue with the present level of supporters?
In terms of the Irish League matches, those are assessed as elite sports, and the spectators that have been risk assessed can continue, as I understand it. In terms of key workers, as I indicated to Ms Cameron, because it's such a short closure, it's not actually a closure at all, it's just a lengthening of the holidays. We won't be able to facilitate, as I understand it, key workers, children in school. So teachers will be off for those 2 weeks. They won't be in school during that period of time. He's right to highlight the fact that off-licences will be closed early. I think that that is an important point. The rationale for that, of course, is that if public houses and other hospitality venues are closed, then at night time there may be a situation where people would seek alcohol and then go to house parties. And of course, he's right to say that homes and house parties are still an issue that need to be dealt with, and indeed anywhere where your social contact is increased. And that's why I'm asking people, pleading with people around personal responsibility and cutting down on the number of social contacts that you have. And if you are in contact with people, that you social distance. If you're in a retail environment, that you wear a mask, and that you do all of the things that we're trying to do to cut down on the transmission of the virus. This is a serious moment for Northern Ireland, Mr. Speaker, and people will either work with us or they'll decide that they'll go their own way. But going their own way has consequences, and has huge consequences for our health service, and they should remember that, because everyone uses our health service, not just those with COVID-19.
I call Jerry Carroll. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to categorically say what happened last night was an absolute shambles, and people are scratching their head asking what's going on up in this building. I want to ask the First Minister, does she agree with me that a much better approach to tackling this virus would be adopting a zero COVID strategy and implementing the necessary financial assistance for the vulnerable, rather than having an endless cycle of circuit breaker and surge, which would undoubtedly cause greater harm to the health and livelihoods in the long run, especially of low-paid workers?
Well, as the member always raises, he thinks that there's a magic money tree at the bottom of the road. There isn't a magic money tree. The money has to come from somewhere. I have to say that the UK government have stepped up to the plate in relation to the furlough scheme, in relation to the financial assistance that we have received during this pandemic. Again, the Chancellor has come forward with a scheme which I recognise is not as generous as the furlough scheme. Of course I do. But the money has to be paid back sometime. We're now in a huge amount of debt as a nation, and that will have consequences for our young people in the future. And our young people have suffered enough through this pandemic, to be quite blunt, and we need to find a way to deal with that. But we will be putting in supports for our businesses. I think it's important to say that. The Executive will meet tomorrow. Currently, Minister for Finance, Minister for the Economy are both working on these issues, and we will discuss them in detail tomorrow at the Executive.
Claire Sugden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the First Minister for her statement. I also wish to acknowledge the Health Minister being in the chamber. Sadly, the Northern Ireland Executive has treated this House with contempt over the last number of days, so I do appreciate you being here and finally giving this House the respect that it deserves. First Minister, will there be guidance in the next 24 hours to add meat to the bones of some of the announcements that you have made? Already I'm being bombarded with questions, and I will do my best to answer them, but I'm struggling to do that on the basis of what is here. I appreciate the regulations themselves will perhaps go into that detail, but if there was a piece of work to be done, it would be about giving clarity to the audience, the people who need the information. And can I also ask, when you're developing a financial package for these businesses who will have to close through government instruction, will you be mindful of those businesses who will be directly impacted by closures in hotels, for example, so musicians, other businesses that work within them, whose businesses will go from zero literally from Friday or even from Monday? How are we going to support them? Because sadly, some of those businesses haven't been supported up until now, and this will only compound the issue, not least for them, but for the wider economy. Thank you.
I thank the member for a question, although I don't accept that we're treating this House with contempt. As you know, Mr Speaker, I've been in front of you on a number of occasions last week and this week. The Minister of Health considers this chamber to be his second home. And so it's wrong to say that we treat this place with contempt. Very, very wrong. In terms of help for artists, we're very much aware of the issue that she raises. As I understand it, the Minister for Communities has put together a scheme which she will be rolling out very soon, because of course a lot of the artists that she speaks about and the event organisers and what have you have not been able to find work or been able to work for quite a considerable length of time. So I know the Minister for Communities is very much aware of that issue and will be dealing with that issue. In terms of the questions and answers, yes, the regulations will bring more clarity in relation to the issues that we decided last night, but there will also be, as I understand it, I'm sure she'll keep me to this, a question and answers digest on Northern Ireland Direct, which will be published as soon as we can do that, Mr Speaker, because I absolutely accept that there will be many, many questions that will be asked by our constituents right across Northern Ireland, so it's important that we try and get that information out to members.
Can I call Joanne Bunting?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question follows on from others. The World Health Organization says it specifically doesn't support draconian restrictions or lockdowns, and they should only be used to buy time to prepare. It also says that poverty will double, as will mental ill health cases in the next year if this continues. As the First Minister has outlined, the debt is rising and there are going to be fewer and fewer people in work to pay for it. So what's being done to protect jobs? And more specifically, will the First Minister clarify, is the Executive looking at help for those who have received none to date? And what is meant by essential health needs? Thank you.
Well, just in relation to that very last point, essential health needs will be defined in the question and answers document that we will put out, because I absolutely accept that my essential health needs might not be somebody else's essential health needs, so there is a need for clarification in relation to that, and we'll get that out as soon as we possibly can. accept what the member says about the World Health Organization, saying that lockdown should only be the last resort and time to prepare, to deal and to get the capacity dealt with. Very clearly, this is not a lockdown. Work continues. People will be working from home where it's not possible, where it's possible, and other work will continue. Retail remains open, manufacturing remains open, except the points about supply chain and the hospitality sector. Of course, that is something that we need to look at. This is a difficult time, Mr. Speaker, and we will need to bring forward supports for those parts of the economy that are being impacted by this decision that we made last night. And as I say, we will have those discussions tomorrow, hopefully with announcements thereafter.
Thank you, and I call Pat Sheehan.
Ceann Comhairle agus buíochas leis an aire sucht a righteous Armagin. I thank the First Minister for her statement this morning. I listened to the First Minister say in response to a question from another member this morning that the clear message coming out from the Executive is that people have to take responsibility, and of course that's absolutely true. However, people are also asking us, what are we doing as political leaders and as the Executive to do our part in dealing with this virus? Some countries have been much more successful in dealing with this virus, and they have used much more nuanced methods and tools to fight it than we have been doing here. Because despite the First Minister's assertion earlier that this is only going to last for 4 weeks, if we don't get our act together, we're going to have to impose more restrictions. The fact is, the impositions of restrictions like this and the first lockdown were a blunt instrument, and if we don't start putting in place a proper system of rigorous testing, tracing, isolating and supporting, then we're going to be faced with more and more restrictions in the future. Would the First Minister not agree with that?
Well, I do think that personal responsibility is a huge part of this. I would say to the member that whilst we can put all of the restrictions in as a government as we desire, if they're not complied with, then the virus will continue to spread. And therefore, people need to take personal responsibility for their actions, and they need to understand why it's important. I accept we have a role in that, in terms of laying out why it's important that they take these decisions. I look across Europe and other parts of the world. I see what they're doing in terms of targeted interventions. I think the Netherlands last night had a similar intervention as we have been talking about today. This is a time-limited intervention. It is an intervention that we hope will bring the R number below 1. At the minute, the R number is about 1.4, 1.5. We need to get it below 1, because then that takes away the transmission of the virus doubling and what have you. So it's important that we get the R below 1, and that's what this intervention is about. And when that happens, then we can come out of the intervention. But that doesn't mean that we then go about as if everything's normal again. We still will then have to do the basics around social distancing, around washing our hands, and that's the problem, because in the summer we became quite lax, quite relaxed. We thought things had gone back to normal, but unfortunately the virus was still there. And as a result, we're now in a situation where we're having to take these interventions, and I regret that is the case. I very much regret that that is the case. But nothing about this is inevitable, and if people now take personal responsibility to themselves and start doing the right things, then we can ensure that this intervention is the intervention that made the difference and stopped the transmission of the virus.
Thank you. I'm going to call Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our health, our economy, our education, our well-being rely on everyone in our community complying with this guidance, and this is a stark wake-up call to everyone in our community that we must comply with this guidance to protect life and livelihood. Can I ask the First Minister, will formal childcare and school-based childcare remain open, and what evidence led to a ban on youth sports rather than spectator gathering at youth sports?
Well, in terms of childcare, continues as is. There's no change in respect of childcare. We think that that is very important, because we know the pressure that parents were under during the March lockdown. School-based childcare, by that I think he means after schools and things like that, obviously won't happen because the children are on a holiday and there will be nobody at the schools. In terms of the youth-based contact sports, obviously the contact sports are not now happening for everyone apart from elite sports, and that we hope will stop the transmission of the virus. His reference to spectators is well made, because I think there's been some bad examples in terms of spectators. We've seen them across this past number of weeks, and unfortunately we've seen the consequences as well. We've seen clusters and spikes in various places, and I think that there's no accident in relation to any of that. So spectators at Irish League games, at rugby and at other elite sports will continue, but they will be very much socially distanced. They will be regulated. We will work with the different sporting codes to make sure that that is the case. And of course, all of these things will be looked at again in the round.
Thank you. And can I say too that we have a further 6 speakers who wish to speak, and if all members will take a shortcut to their question, we might just get them all in. So please keep your questions concise. Christopher Stalford.
Try not to take that as a hint.
Don't take it personal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I thank my right honourable friend for the statement that she has made. I think it is important. The health messaging was not undermined by my right honourable friend at any point, and she has striven valiantly to do her best throughout this crisis. Others, including a signature to this statement, had a hand in undermining public confidence in the health messaging. The measures announced will impact upon the lowest paid, particularly in the hospitality sector. Can I ask for further information in that regard? And further, yesterday's newsletter editorial stated, "It's incredible that school closures could even be on the table, especially as the idea was rejected in the Prime Ministers in the Republic of Ireland." Can I ask my right honourable friend to resist absolutely in the Executive any attempt to extend the closure of our schools, because it is crucially important that our children and young people have access to their education?
I thank the member for his question. I think we're all very conscious of hospitality workers and the fact that many of them are on zero-hour contracts and on minimum wage. And when I say that the new job scheme is not as generous as the furlough scheme, it is those people that I'm thinking of, because it gives 2/3 of payment, and of course that's only if you're not on a 0 hour or if indeed you haven't been made redundant and you're a flexible worker. So I mean, we fully accept that, and there's a need for us to be aware of that. And I'm hoping that later on today I'll meet with representatives of Hospitality Ulster and we will discuss some of these very important issues. In terms of education, the member is right to point out that in terms of the closure of education at the highest level of their tiers in the Republic of Ireland and indeed in England, there is no suggestion that education will close. And let me be clear, education is not closing in Northern Ireland. We're just taking an extended holiday break to facilitate the hour number being pushed down. We are not closing schools, and I think it's very important that we say that. Schools will come back on the 2nd of November. I want to say that very loudly. I know there's been some commentary this morning from very worried parents thinking, no, this is the start of it. Now we're going to be in a situation where our children aren't going to be at school. We're going to be back in a March-April situation where children aren't getting the learning that they need to move ahead with their lives. And so, to be very clear, children will return to school on the 2nd of November, and I think that is absolutely the right thing to do.
Thank you. And I call Sinead McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, First Minister, for your statement here today. This has been a very difficult decision, I'm sure, for all members of the Executive, and we have to get it right, and it's really difficult to get the balance right between lives and livelihoods. And I have a very close friend at the moment that is fighting this virus in hospital, and so I'm very cognizant of the public health message and welcome it here today. But I'm going to ask you a question, not my question, but I got this in from a business leader in the city. Bearing in mind Derry is 9 days into these restrictions already, so This is what he said to me this morning. These restrictions are a further disaster for Derry, the lowest paid in hospitality. Most hairdressers and barbers rent a chair. City centre is a scary place right now. Foyleside is 77% down on footfall. Taxis and small retailers are on their knees. Never mind poverty, many will be plunged into destitution. Supporting these restrictions without support going directly to these individuals is enormously dangerous and unforgivable. What would you say to that business leader?
Well, thank the member, and I'm very sorry to hear that she has a friend suffering from COVID in hospital, and I send my good wishes to her. In terms of the very direct question that you asked me, and I do recognise that her local government area have been in these restrictions for a period of time now, and we will hopefully see in the next couple of days if they have had an impact in terms of the transmission of the virus. As we know, it always takes a lag time for there to be any impact in terms of the transmission of the virus. Absolutely hear what she's saying in relation to the lowest paid, and we will have that discussion tomorrow to try and give clarity around all of that. Retail remains open, as she knows, but I accept that footfall is down. And when we first put household restrictions in places like Ballymena and Belfast, we've seen footfall go down dramatically. Retail is still open. You can still travel in a taxi with all of the appropriate safeguards. But I do accept that there are people who will now take this and not want to be out and about. It is okay to be out and about as long as you take the appropriate safeguards, and I think that that is important, because we do need to try and get that balance of keeping the economy going, I accept, at a lesser level than we would like, but to make sure that we keep people safe as well. And she will know that, given that her friend is in hospital suffering from COVID, but she has a great passion for the economy of the North West, and I understand that.
I call Robbie Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for attending this morning. And I'd want to join Pam Cameron and pay tribute to the families who lost loved ones this week due to COVID. I'm sure you'll join with me, Minister. Also want to pay tribute to the many teachers who have been on their knees for a number of weeks now and have done their best in our schools. And with regard to our schools and the ongoing pressures that they face, Minister, can you give a commitment that the Executive will support the Finance Minister and the Education Minister with regard to the needed development of the blended learning and online facilities that may be required for further school admissions, and that all evidence taken in terms of any further school closures will be from the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer?
I thank the member for his question, and I do indeed want to, and it was remiss of me not to do it when Ms Cameron raised the issue, sent my sympathy and empathy to those people who have lost loved ones to COVID-19 and indeed to many other diseases over this past period of time. In terms of education, I think I have been clear that the last thing we want to do is to get to a situation where we're in that awful phrase, blended learning, again. I don't think it helps children. It's certainly a huge pressure and strain on our teachers, and I want to pay a tribute to our teachers for having to take up that strain earlier on this year. I think I've pointed out that from the PHA's point of view, in schools is a very low transmission rate, although I do accept that there are issues around the school that we may need to put more mitigations in. But I think as a policy objective, Mr Speaker, we should always try and ensure that our children have an education and our children are at school. That's certainly what I want to ensure, and I hope that I'll be joined in that with other members of the Executive, because whilst I hear what the member is saying about taking interventions in school and blended learning, we have to also take into account the impact that this will have on their life chances in the future, and what it will do to them from a mental health point of view if they're at home and not integrating with their peers. And I've seen that right across the piece when children were at home, maybe lone children, children who are only children at home on their own without any interaction with other younger people. It is not good for children not to be together. And therefore, from my point of view, education should be our #1 priority, and I hope that it is for everybody around this chamber.
Call Pat Cabinet.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, First Minister. Given that these restrictions come into effect on Friday, it's crucial that businesses have clarity. First Minister, will you agree, First Minister, to commit and publish the full guidance to businesses by the end of the day and outline the support that will be put in place? Thank you.
I thank the member for his question. I absolutely accept that businesses need clarity, they need guidance, they need to see the regulations. That is why these restrictions are coming into place on Friday as opposed to today, to give time to get all of that dealt with so that people will have that clarity. And as I've said many times, I hope that the support package will be signed off tomorrow as well.
I call Rachel Woods.
Mr Speaker, and to the First Minister and Health Minister for coming today. I note that the closure of some of our sectors while having others open, which surely is a purely political decision on the face of it without seeing the evidence of transmission in certain settings. It's also surely a political decision not to have adequate support in place before today's announcement, but I'm glad to learn that information is due tomorrow. There does remain so many questions. What is unnecessary travel? Is it enforceable? What is a mass event? What happens to hotels and B&Bs? What about those who were shielding before? What do they do? Will there be information for them? But for the hospitality industry, the majority of whom have gone above and beyond to keep their staff and customers safe in exceptionally difficult circumstances, is the new furlough scheme it? But First Minister, to a specific question, when do these changes come in exactly? Can you clarify when closures come in for the hospitality sector? Are last orders in pubs and restaurants tomorrow night or Friday?
Well, the member has covered a lot of ground in a very short time, but just to say there in relation to shielding, and it's an issue that Ms Cameron raised as well, and I didn't get a chance to say that. This has been looked at by the Chief Medical Officers across the 4 nations. The last time she will remember in terms of lockdown, we took a huge blanket approach to shielding. I think the Chief Medical Officer told me this week that it was nearly 280,000 people were shielding, which was incredible because when we started out we thought it would be about 80,000 people. So we need to take a more nuanced approach to that. I know that there's a lot of people who are vulnerable or perhaps older who are very, very worried at present, and we must recognise that, and we shouldn't be using phrases like lockdown because those people will see those phrases and feel that they should be not going out anywhere and should be just in the house, and they will be very afraid and worried about that. There will be shielding advice coming forward, but it will be more nuanced and more targeted than it was in the past. I do recognise the member's frustration as well that she doesn't have all of the answers. Can I share something with her? I don't have all of the answers. We're dealing with a pandemic, we're dealing at speed. There's a man sitting in front of you who will tell you what it's like to work at speed. And we're trying to work through all of the answers, and the reason that I came to the Chamber this morning was to give people a heads up that this is a direction of travel. We will have the guidance and the regulation and hopefully all of the answers in place before Friday. And to answer her very specific question, 6 o'clock on Friday is the target for when these regulations will take effect.
Okay, I call Matthew O'Toole.
Mr Speaker, thank you to the First Minister for coming and giving us this update today. I don't think anyone is in any doubt about the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in and the fact that the Executive is having to work at pace. But First Minister, can I ask you, in relation to the statement today, it doesn't make clear, and I would ask you if you would be willing to make clear, that the action being taken today, though I welcome it and it is absolutely essential given the skyrocketing incidence of the virus here, that today, the purpose of today's actions and the further restrictions is not to suppress the virus. It's not to beat the virus in the short term, because it won't do that. It's very important that people do not think that in 4 weeks' time this virus will go away and it'll be okay by Christmas. The blunt truth is that this is about buying time for our health service in order for it not to be overwhelmed. Could she confirm that? And would she also agree with me that it would help in terms of assuring the public about the purpose of this if the full, detailed guidance could be published from both the CMO and the Chief Scientific Advisor?
Thank the member for his question. Look, what we're trying to do, as we've always tried to do, is push down the transmission of the virus to get the R number below 1. At the minute, it's about 1.5. We need to get it below 1. So that's what this targeted intervention is designed to do. It's also designed to make sure that the capacity of our hospitals is able to cope with what is coming into those hospitals. We set out those priorities back in March, that is what we were trying to do, and of course to minimise death. It was those three priorities that we had to the fore. So when in 4 weeks' time we come back to the situation, ideally what we would want to see is that the R is below 1. Then we can lift the restrictions, and then we will still continue to have to do all of the basic things: social distancing, making sure that we continue to wash our hands, to keep the virus under control in that fashion. We have to take these interventions now, Mr Speaker, because the virus has gone out of control in some places, and that's why we're having to take these interventions, which I very much regret. Very much regret. None of this is something I come to the House with any joy today at all. We're interfering with people's lives. We're interfering with people's ability to make money so that they can live. And we then have to try and support those people, and that is what we will have to focus on now in the coming days.
And I call Sinead Bradley.
Mr Speaker, I would like to make comment. The statement relies heavily on calls for responsible behaviour for all, and I wholeheartedly support that. But further to Mr Nesbitt's earlier question, I'd like to ask the First Minister, will extra resources or support be provided to all of those who are assisted and charged with carrying out enforcement duties?
Yes, well, we will be continuing to work with those people who want to help us on compliance and on enforcement of the regulations. We work with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, we're working with local government in terms of their environmental health officers, and indeed with Health and Safety Executive and other issues. But I mean, to go back to the first point that the members made, personal responsibility is a wonderful thing. We've all been given free will, but I hope that people listening today will realise that if they do what we're asking them to do, then it has a consequence and it will help us to get the virus under control. I can make all of the restrictions that I want, but if people are not prepared to comply with them, then we're going to have a really serious problem in a couple of weeks' time. And I do not want to be in that place, and I would urge all of the members to work with us so that we can deal with this terrible situation we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Nicole. Dolores Kelly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the First Minister for her answers thus far. There are still some concerns around schools, First Minister, in terms of, in the event that people have to be educated at home, will the 2-week period timeframe be used constructively by the Education Minister and others in relation to ensuring that children and young people from more deprived communities who don't have access to technology, who don't have access to the high cost of printing off papers, etc., will additional support measures be given to those families in a very targeted way?
I think the member makes a very relevant point, because when our schools are closed, it is the children that she refers to that suffer. It is those children who don't have access to the internet, who don't have Wi-Fi, who perhaps have parents who aren't that interested in education. The usual line is, if it was good enough for me, it's good enough for you, which frankly isn't good enough. And we need to make sure that our young people are in schools, because then they get the attention that they need from their teachers and from their peers. And I really do appeal to people to think about this. We need our young people in school, our vulnerable young people. It's a terrible thing to say, but some vulnerable young people, the safest place for them is in school. It's not in their homes. And therefore, to me, this is an absolute priority, and we have to ensure that our young people have schools to go to, have safe places to go to, and can then develop as the young people that we want them to be.
Members, that concludes questions on the statement. Thank you very much to all those who have contributed.
Welcome back. Good morning. It's 10 minutes to midday. We've been watching a special sitting of the Northern Ireland Assembly this morning, with the First Minister giving details about more restrictions to come into force as soon as 6 p.m. on Friday for Northern Ireland. Now, Arlene Foster couldn't be more clear during that. This is not a lockdown. In fact, she said that work will continue, retail and manufacturing remains open. It's okay to be out and about so long as you take appropriate care. She said on more than one occasion during her statements today that this is not a lockdown. In fact, going as far as she said, saying she does not like this notion, lockdown. So we're effectively looking at the anticipated circuit breaker for Northern Ireland. We had always heard that this could come in to bearing around the half-term break. It has happened probably earlier than even those who were predicting it expected. And that means from 6 o'clock on Friday, a whole host of new restrictions come into force for Northern Ireland. It affects us all. It affects the way we go about our business. It will affect everyday life for at least the next month. So, taking it from the top, here's exactly what we've just learned and what has now been confirmed to us. The entire shutdown of the hospitality sector, apart from deliveries and takeaways, although we do await for the guidance on some of these matters in and around some of the more specific sectors and the more specific detail. For example, hotels, where do they fit into this? We need to hear a little bit more on that later in the morning. We will, of course, keep you up to date. Restaurants, cafes, pubs and bars will close at 6 o'clock on Friday for 4 weeks. Schools will close for 2 weeks from Monday. That includes the half-term break, and then it will be reviewed. Expected return to school then, first week of November, 2nd of November for the kids. That doesn't add a huge amount of restriction onto the schools, maybe just an extra week or an extra few days, depending on what way the holidays worked out at your kids' individual schools. But clearly you could hear from the First Minister and certainly the DUP were not in favour of any closing down of the schools in Northern Ireland. So this has been somewhat of a compromise, so a much shorter period where kids will be without their schooling. Fast food and takeaway businesses will have to close at 11 o'clock. Shops and off licences will not be allowed to sell alcohol after 8 o'clock in the evening. Gyms will only be allowed to remain open for individual training. No classes will be permitted. And again, this is a point of difference from the high level that has been brought in some of the UK regions. We saw this happen in Liverpool during the week, where they went to high level there, and along with the closing down of the hospitality sector in Liverpool, betting shops, leisure centres and gyms were also brought into that and had to close. In Northern Ireland, we're doing things for some reason not known to any of us at this hour a little bit different. So we're hearing about close contact services closing down on Friday. Hairdressers, nail salons, beauty therapists, places like that. However, gyms will remain open, but only for individual training, and no classes will be permitted. So a point of difference there with the way England have gone with things. No indoor sport of any kind or organised contact sport involving mixing of households other than at elite level. We talked about the close contact services. They'll close down from Friday, apart from those meeting what they're saying is the defined essential health requirements, and we expect more published detail on that later in the day too. Mobile hairdressers and makeup artists will be prevented from working and providing their services in people's homes from this week. No mixing of households in private dwellings. That's already in force across the province. That stays to be the case. Bubbling limited to 10 people, they're saying, from 2 households.